Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility. And they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself. Welcome back to the Court Documentation Podcast. I'm Dr. Carolina James, and today we are talking about one of the biggest questions parents have when they're documenting. What happens after I hand this over? Because let's be honest, most parents spend months, sometimes years, carefully documenting. You save the emails, you save the text messages, you keep the incident logs, you gather school records, medical records, therapy records, you create timelines, you organize evidence, and somewhere along the way you start wondering, is anyone actually going to read this? Will they understand what I'm trying to show? What if they miss the point completely? I understand those fears because I've had them myself. I remember early in my own documentation journey feeling like every detail mattered. Every message, every incident, every interaction. I was terrified that if I left something out, people wouldn't understand the seriousness of what was happening. I thought the key was giving professionals more information. What I've learned over the years is that the key is actually making information easier to use. And that's a very different thing. One of the biggest shifts happened when I stopped asking, how do I prove my case? And started asking, how do professionals consume information? Because judges, GALs, custody evaluators, therapists, and attorneys do not read documentation the way parents imagine they do. They're not sitting down with a cup of coffee, reading every page cover to cover. They're not emotionally invested in your story the way you are. They're not spending hours studying every detail. They are scanning, filtering, triaging, looking for signals, and understanding that completely changed how I document it. Let's start with judges. One thing I think parents forget is that judges make decisions under extraordinary time pressure. They are managing huge caseloads, they are reviewing countless documents, they are hearing multiple cases. And when they receive your documentation, they are not trying to become experts on your life. They are trying to answer a few critical questions quickly. Questions like, is this parent credible? Is this situation stable? Is there a pattern? Does intervention appear necessary? That's it. When you understand those questions, documentation becomes much easier because you stop trying to tell your entire story and you start helping professionals answer theirs. One thing that surprised me when I began working more closely with attorneys was realizing how quickly professionals assess tone. Parents often assume professionals are focused entirely on content. They are not. They notice tone immediately, not because they're judging your emotions, because tone tells them something about reliability. Think about it this way. Imagine two parents describing the same event. One sounds calm, factual, and measured. The other sounds frantic, emotional, and reactive. Even if both are describing something serious, professionals naturally feel more confident with the information that feels organized and balanced. That doesn't mean your emotions aren't valid. Of course they are. But documentation and emotional processing serve different purposes. One thing I had to learn myself was that court documents are not therapy journals. They are not the place where I process my fear, anger, grief, or frustration. They're the place where I communicate information, and that distinction matters. Now, let's talk about GALs, guardians ad litem, and custody evaluators, because parents often imagine these professionals are looking for completely different things. In reality, they're asking many of the same questions. The difference is that they're often comparing information across multiple sources. When a guardian ad litem reads your records, they are not just reading your records. They are comparing them to school records, therapy records, interviews, observations, prior records, communications, and records from the other side. One of the things they're constantly asking themselves is, does this information align? Not because they're trying to catch you, well, maybe sometimes they do, because they're trying to understand consistency. And consistency is incredibly important. I often tell parents that credibility isn't built through intensity, it's built through consistency. A single dramatic event may get attention. A consistent pattern gets weight. Those are different things. When I look back at my own documentation, one of the most powerful realizations was understanding that patterns are what professionals remember, not individual incidents, patterns. Professionals may forget the details of one email. They may forget the specifics of one exchange, but they will remember a recurring pattern that appears 20 times. And that's exactly why documentation works best when it's organized around themes rather than emotion. Another thing professionals notice very quickly is organization. And honestly, I think this is something parents underestimate. When a professional opens a well-organized file, they've already learned something before reading a single word. They've learned that the parent can manage information. They've learned that the parent understands structure. They've learned that the parent can separate facts from feelings. That matters more than many people realize. I know this firsthand because I've handed professionals everything from massive stacks of records to carefully organized exhibits. The response is dramatically different, not because the information changed, because usability changed. Professionals are human. If they have to work hard to understand your documentation, they're naturally more cautious. Not because they're annoyed, because uncertainty increases when information is difficult to navigate. This is one of the reasons I became so passionate about teaching documentation. I realized that most parents weren't struggling because they lacked evidence. They were struggling because nobody had taught them how professionals consume information. Another thing judges, guardian ad litems, and evaluators notice is restraint. This one is hard for a lot of parents because when you're living through something painful, or watch your child live through something painful, everything feels important. I completely get that. I've been there. But professionals often view selective documentation as a sign of judgment. It tells them this parent can distinguish between what matters and what doesn't. When parents document every frustration, every irritation, every disagreement, it can unintentionally dilute the issues that truly matter. Professionals are constantly evaluating significance. Your job isn't to document everything. Your job is to document what is meaningful. That's a huge difference. One lesson that completely changed how I approached court documentation was learning to stop over-explaining. This was very hard for me. Maybe it's hard for you too, because parents often think, if I don't explain everything, they won't understand. But professionals often think, if this requires extensive explanation, maybe the pattern isn't as strong as the parent believes. That realization was incredibly freeing because it taught me to trust the evidence, to trust the pattern, to trust the timeline, to trust the records. Patterns don't need convincing language. Patterns speak for themselves. Another thing professionals respect is honesty about uncertainty. This surprises many parents. They think confidence means certainty. It doesn't. Some of the strongest documentation includes statements like, "The outcome remains unclear. This concern has not yet been resolved. Additional information may become available." Those statements actually increase credibility because they demonstrate balance. Professionals trust people who acknowledge what they don't know. Before we finish, I want to leave you with something reassuring. You do not need to become an expert on every judge, every guardian ad litem, every evaluator, every attorney. You don't need to predict exactly what each person prefers. You simply need to create documentation that is clear, organized, calm, and consistent. Those qualities travel well across courts, across professionals, across systems. And perhaps most importantly, they reduce your own anxiety. Because when your records can stand on their own, you stop feeling like you have to stand next to them explaining everything. And that's the goal. Not persuasion, not validation, usability. I often tell parents that the strongest documentation is documentation that can walk into a room without you and still make sense. That's the standard we're aiming for, and it's absolutely something you can learn. This week's action step is simple. Take one piece of documentation you've created recently and ask yourself, if a stranger read this without me in the room, would they understand it? If the answer is no, simplify, clarify, organize, because every improvement in usability increases the likelihood that your message will be heard. Thank you for joining me for another episode of the Court Documentation Podcast. Until next time, remember, professionals are not looking for the loudest story. They are looking for the clearest pattern. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything, you don't need to be perfect, and you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.economocoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.